Hello and welcome back to the UK Net Zero Action Monthly, our map to a renewable future now that it can be done here in the UK and pretty much everywhere. In episode 1, we saw for the first time what renewable generation technology we're going to get. It is the only one big enough we can afford to achieve net zero here in the UK and with the minimum carbon emissions possible along the way. At its core are floating wind turbines far out to sea. But that's just the beginning. According to my calculations, revealed over the next 3 episodes, the race is now on to literally float up to 1,700 wind turbines every year to begin within 5 years. That, my friends, is the only way we can achieve net zero here in the UK by our 2050 deadline. And don't take my word for it. It is the opinion of our leading maritime engineer, Professor Susan Gorvanek, Chair in Emerging Maritime Technologies at the Royal Institute. There is no better source. Now, in these next few episodes, we will calculate how many offshore wind turbines we will actually need for net zero, and that will inform us on how to go about it. This transition to a renewables power is going to be our biggest test as a nation since the Second World War, possibly ever. Unlike that period of suffering and loss, however, this is simply a challenge to our organizational prowess. But if we fail, the outcome will be the same, catastrophic for our descendants. We have to start floating these wind turbines within 4 to 5 years, or else we could very likely lose the Antarctic ice sheet. And at that point, it will just be too late. So let's try to get this going within 3 or 4 years. Call me Noah, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and let's dive in. Our path to net zero begins with a singular, somewhat elusive number, one that has never been published by an official source, to my knowledge, although surely someone in government must have it. It is simply the amount of electricity we will need to generate each and every day when everything in the UK, and I really do mean everything, runs on electricity. We start with that number to find out how many wind turbines we should need to deliver this power consistently every hour over the entire year to keep everything running smoothly. Now, obviously, that amount of power consumption is huge. It is much more than just the electricity we currently generate, because today most of our economy still runs on fossil fuel, oil, gas, petrol, diesel, and even a little coal. Furthermore, we also use a lot of fossil fuel to generate electricity and a shocking amount of fuel just to convert and deliver that same fossil fuel, which amazingly works out to 25% of our entire energy bill, so to speak. That's horrendous, but for us in our present predicament, it's also good news. It means we can eliminate that 25% from our future needs right off the top. So we should need less power under net zero and 25% fewer turbines for it. You will see we need to get that number down as much as possible. And there are other cuts we can make off the top without inconveniencing anyone. Turns out fossil fuel is much less efficient as a source of energy than electricity. So as we get to net zero, we will use less power overall than we do today to do the same amount of work. For this reason, in taking a stab at this, I had to do some geeky tweaking to come up with the likely figure for our total electricity consumption on day one of net zero. So let's call that Z day, which will hopefully be in 2049, 2050 or before. So to begin this calculation, one proviso. I have taken a stab at this based on an official government data from 2019, the year before COVID. But by 2050, that number could be very different. why it could be even lower as our overall energy use has been falling for 20 years, mainly on improvements in household appliances and the loss of our industrial base. Whatever happens, though, I still expect this calculation to be within the range of future possibilities. So after most of all my tweaking, I find this number to be 3.71. 3.71 terawatt hours, which is 3.71 billion kilowatts. That is my best shot for the amount of electricity we will need to generate on average every day over the whole year to keep everything in the UK running smoothly. But then, of course, with wind power, we will also use electricity to make green hydrogen as the long-term power storage mechanism to offset the intermittent nature of wind. As you will see, this implies we will need more than 3.71 terawatt hours to guarantee that we can supply 3.71 terawatt hours every day. I will deal with that calculation in the next episode, but for now, I will explain how I get to 3.71. In fact, for the purposes of calculating the number of wind turbines we need, we must reduce that daily amount to an hourly amount, which works out to 154 gigawatt hours per hour. To begin, just to explain something people find confusing, a wind turbine rated at 6 megawatts, say, would produce 6 megawatts per hour at a 100% load capacity. But they rarely ever do that. Mostly they generate power at an average load capacity of 40 to 50% or so at sea. So at 50%, it would be generating 3 megawatt hours per hour. So we use this combination of turbine capacity and load factor to work out how many wind turbines we will need. And before some of the more knowledgeable among you say this exercise is futile because there is no way to store that vast quantity of otherwise fickle wind power other than with the very expensive green hydrogen, I have a cunning plan. If you listen on, I explain the way we must navigate a future entirely dependent on fickle wind power in episode 3. So, how did I come up with my basic daily average estimate of 3.71? As you see from Table 1, which uses the official UK data from the Office of National Statistics, in 2019, before the pandemic, we used 142 million tons of oil equivalent to power everything in the UK. And yes, that is after the deduction of that 25%. Okay, that then gets me to my starting number of 142 million tons of oil equivalent. And as you can see on this table, in electrical terms, that works out to 1,652 terawatt hours per annum. Now, when that number is converted into the number of wind turbines we would need, we see it seems to suggest we need too many for it to be a practical route to net zero. It implies we would need to make and install almost 70,000 6 megawatt wind turbines over the next 25 years, although we will, of course, get help from our neighbours, as this is going to be a huge, new, profitable and prestigious industry. Make no mistake about it, with thousands upon thousands of new jobs. But happily, there will also be other big savings in our energy consumption on Z Day, so we can make without any loss of convenience to us. As you can see here on Table 2, with the biggest of these, I can make another cut to get this base number down to 1,354 terawatt hours per annum, or our 3.71 terawatt hours per day. So how did I do that? Well, as you see on Table 1, The Office of National Statistics breaks down everything between industry, domestic, transport, and services. And you will notice in this scheme that transport is currently the biggest consumer of all those four categories. This is because around 95% of the fuel we used for road transport in 2019 was petrol and diesel, and those petrol and diesel engines are massively inefficient. It is quite well known that EV motors, which are of course electric, require only a third or less the energy used by petrol and diesel engines, some say only a quarter overall, to do the same work. So I had to jump through various technical hoops to make adjustments to our road transport energy consumption data in order to reflect those savings. As you will find out, I believe I have erred somewhat on the side of caution in this by doing a bottom-up analysis of transport energy uses to test those top-down numbers from the ONS. I did this by revising my ONS transport numbers using actual consumption data from each transport category, so cars, vans, lorries, coaches, and buses. I obtained actual miles traveled in each category for 2022 from the Society of Motor Manufacturers, with data showing actual consumption in each category. Now, in hourly terms, as you see on this table, I expect the road transport bill to be using about 16.1 gigawatt hours per hour after the adjustment, while other transport, which is not adjusted, of course, will be using the same amount it did in 2019, which is the equivalent of 29.1 gigawatt hours per hour, albeit they will be using hydrogen rather than fossil fuel. Now, as a result, the other transport fuel bill becomes the biggest one and almost twice the size of the road transport usage. This raises an intriguing prospect that we could potentially halve that 29.1 gigawatt hours with the use of biofuels, and so use less green hydrogen in the mix, perhaps. Aeroplanes are already flying on that. With that, we might reduce our overall transport consumption to something more like 30 gigawatt hours per hour from this 45.2 gigawatt hours per hour. That would represent a huge reduction, in effect cutting our overall annual power consumption by 133 terawatt hours per annum to about 1,220 terawatt hours per annum, or 10%. That would then make another big difference, and I believe it is a future possibility, but I cannot yet include it, sadly, although I do believe we will get there eventually. I also believe that as big as it is, this cut to our future road transport fuel consumption, reflecting EV efficiency, is pretty cautious. It works out to 70%, whereas it could have been more like 75. But my final thought on this transport calculation is that that EV efficiency metric saves us having to deploy substantially more wind turbines, and without that and certain other savings, this whole project could have been impractical. With that, I think we can now take fate into our own hands and give it our British best. So you see from this exercise, things will change radically in our transition to net zero, but I still believe with this approach, we can continue to enjoy the conveniences to which we are now accustomed. I do, however, wonder why the government has yet to draw attention to the massive savings available with net zero. We hear that Boris was scientifically challenged, quote unquote, that he did not grasp these details would certainly help explain his eventual advocacy of nuclear power and our general inaction on net zero, despite his sloganeering. But this oversight is often pointed out to Rishi too, both by his own advisors and by the press. You don't have to take it from me. Inaction on net zero is inexcusable. Spin is not acceptable. So vote net zero. So until the next episode, episode 3, when I solve that heating conundrum, then go on to predict how many offshore wind floaters we will need to achieve net zero by matching their output to future consumption levels. I bid you adieu, and I say only this: whatever your political shade, make sure you vote net zero in the upcoming elections, because this has not gone away. And according to climate change experts like Dr. Gilbs on this same network, we have no more than 4 or 5 years to get this started. That is the possible length of our next government. So we have to make sure they're going to be more focused on this than our present one. Thank you very much.